How's it going, everyone? Welcome to our first lecture. This one's going to be about domains and a little bit about what constitutes a living organism. So here's an interesting thing that I want to talk about, and it's just the history of life on our planet and the sheer vast amount of time that the Earth has been around, and how small of an amount of time that some organisms that you're very familiar with, including humans, have been around. So let's first start on the left side of this graph, and you'll notice that the Earth originates or begins or comes about around 4.6 or so, give or take, billion years ago. So that's billion with a B. And then it's quite some time that the Earth is around where you get what we consider to be the origin of life, the first living organism to appear. And then we go quite some more amount of time where we see the first life forms that are fossilized, then the first organisms that can do photosynthesis. So if you're not familiar with photosynthesis is, it's how some organisms are able to take the energy that is found in sunlight, and create food energy, for basically food particles for themselves. And so we'll get into that a little bit later, but that comes somewhere around 3.4 billion years ago. And then oxygen begins to accumulate in the atmosphere sometime 2.5 billion years ago. And why is that? Well, if you're familiar about photosynthesis, one of the byproducts of photosynthesis is oxygen. So it takes quite some time before we get an accumulation of oxygen, which is a byproduct of photosynthesis, in the atmosphere. And then sometime after that, we get our first single-celled plants. And that would continue to become do more photosynthesis and then create more oxygen in the atmosphere until, look at this little red section here. This little section is blown up on this side, and now we're working in millions of years because we're past 1 billion years ago. And now we're blowing up this, and look at how many things happen in a relatively, now I say shorter, but this is still 600 million years. But in terms of 5 billion years, that's quite a short amount of time. You get the first invertebrates, the Cambrian explosion, the first fish, first land plants and land animals, the first amphibians, reptiles. You get extinctions that happen, the first mammals, that's what we are, right? We're mammals. First flowering plants and insects, the first primates, and the first hominids is somewhere like 200 million years ago. Now, maybe you're not really sure why I'm so excited about this graph. And that could be from the fact that we're just, as humans, it's very, very hard for us to distinguish the terms million and billion. They all seem so large, and just how different they are. Well, let's take a look at this picture. This is a graphical image of the difference between a million and $1 billion. So you can see that there is quite a large difference between 1 million and 1 billion. And so this is sort of the argument you hear for when you might hear people say billionaires should be paying their fair share amount of taxes. And some people get that confused with, well, millionaires. If I make $1 million, should I be paying so much taxes? It's really because we can't even really fathom what $1 billion looks like, much let alone hundreds of billions of dollars. Anyway, not to get into too much of that world, but it's something to keep in mind, the difference between a million and a billion. Here are some facts. 1 million seconds is about 11 and a half days. 1 billion seconds is 31.69 years. 1 trillion seconds, if we're going to just keep going up this scale, is 31,688 years. Earth is, like I said, about somewhere between 4.5, 4.6 billion years old. The first fish come around 500 million years ago. The first dinosaurs are, interesting enough, 250 million years ago. The first birds, 150 million years ago, along with the first flowering plants. The first primates, about 100 million years ago. And extinctions of the dinosaur, 66 million years ago. And here's the interesting one. 2 million years ago, we evolve, and that means that we've only been here for 0.044% of Earth's history. So less than less than 0.05, half a percent of Earth's history, and we have changed the scale, the face of this Earth, altered it, sometimes irreparably, sometimes many times for the better. But that's something that we'll get into way, way down the line when we talk about climates and climate change. But this is some interesting facts to think about when you think about the difference between a million and a billion, and just how long the Earth was around before really any of these cool organisms that we're going to talk about ever came about. Okay, now let's talk about the characteristics. These are a few characteristics that all living organisms have. And the first one is called order. And organisms have to be highly organized, they have to have coordinated structures, and they must consist of one or more cells. So living organisms can be as simplistic as a single-celled organism to something like us that has billions upon millions upon billions of highly specialized cells that all do different things but make up one organism. In multicellular organisms, like you see on this toad, you'll see similar cells that form tissues, tissues that create tissue systems, that create organs, organs that create specific structures in the body, called organ systems. Like, for instance, our digestive system is one of our systems in which many different organs work together to accomplish a similar task. But anyway, the first characteristic of life is order. What's the next? The next is something called sensitivity or response to a stimuli. And here you see a mimosa plant, sometimes called a sensitive plant. And if I can get this to run again for you, you can see that it touches, it responds to a touch, and it closes up its leaves. And this response is really, it evolved due to defense against herbivory, and that is getting eaten by bugs or perhaps other animals. And so if it feels a touch, it would think that it's a bug is landing on it to eat it, and it closes up. Now, organisms can respond, that's a negative stimulus where you're moving away from some sort of stimulus, but organisms can also respond positively. If you have a movement towards a stimulus, it's considered the positive response. If you have a movement away from a stimulus, it's called a negative response. So if you are in your bedroom and your mom starts making cookies and you come out of your bedroom towards the kitchen, and positive response to the stimulus of cookies being baked, that is a positive response. At the same time, if your drain backs up into your sink and you run away pinching your nose, that would be called a negative stimulus. And so that's just an example, not to joke around too much, but there's some examples for you. Here is some other characteristics, which is organisms have to be able to reproduce, either sexually, like we know that we do, where a male provides sperm, a female provides an egg, they form together to form a zygote, a bunch of divisions happen, you get an embryo, somewhere around 9 months later a baby is born. Or you can have an organism that reproduces asexually, where two identical clones, an identical clone is produced. Now, our cells reproduce like this. That's called mitotic division. And maybe we'll talk about that at some other time. But organisms, single-celled organisms, also can asexually reproduce. When you are reproducing, you are passing along your what are called genes. Genes are DNA that are passed along to your offspring, and those genes are the code for what you are. And at some point we'll talk about RNA and DNA and what all that stuff means. But these genes are the code for you. Now, they are the reason that you look similar to your parents, but you don't look identical unless you have an identical twin. But so there are changes in the DNA code that are made every time an organism reproduces through sexual reproduction, but they are exactly the same identical clones if they produce asexually. I'll give you a second to read that and then I will continue on. So, what's another characteristic of life? Growth and development. So the reason why, unfortunately, those cute puppies that you see there do not remain cute and puppy-sized all their life, although I like old dogs too, it's because they grow and develop following those very specific instructions that are coded for by their genes. Those genes, like I said, they are the instruction booklet, the instruction manual, and it tells your cells what to do, how to behave, and how to grow. And that ensures that when a species is young, they do not, they grow up and they do not look the same as they did when they're young as they are when they are older. Okay, the next characteristic of life is organisms are always looking to maintain what is called homeostasis. And basically what that is an organism's cells are going to need to be in appropriate conditions for them to be working at the proper ideal level. So there are appropriate conditions like the proper temperature, the proper pH, and if you're not familiar with pH, it's how basic or acidic something is. Something that's very basic like bleach versus something that's very acidic like battery acid, okay? Something like water is relatively neutral, and that has like about a 7 pH. Um, a very acidic pH is down to 1, and the most basic is down to 14. If a cell is not at homeostasis, for instance, if the pH or the temperature becomes too high or too low, those cells will not work ideally, and cellular processes will stop, and that would unfortunately lead to death. Okay, another characteristic of life is metabolism, or energy processing, and all organisms that are living have to do some sort of metabolic process, whether they are capturing energy from the sun, like you see in that plant that's growing, that's doing photosynthesis, or they're using other organisms to get the molecules that they need for their cells. So you can see that tiger is protecting that kill that it just made. It will eat the body of that organism, take in those chemicals, and their cells will use those molecules to produce an energy for the cell that is called cellular respiration. So there's photosynthesis for organisms that can make their own energy, and organisms that need to get energy from other organisms do cellular respiration. And we'll talk more about that as we go on as well. Another characteristic of life is the ability to adapt. In organisms, what that means is organisms have traits that give them advantages to living in their specific environments. Now, variation of individuals is important for a healthy species, and without it, the species won't be able to adapt. And you'll see variation in all of the organisms that we talk about, and you will see how organisms have been able to evolve over many millions of years to become the well-working individuals that are well specifically adapted to the environments that they are in currently. I want to stress that an organism cannot will itself to evolve, okay? One of the early thoughts about how organisms evolved was created by a scientist named Lamarck, and he has a very famous drawing where he shows a giraffe that is stretching its neck for leaves, and as it eats all the leaves on the lower limb, it has to stretch its neck and stretch its neck to get higher and higher leaves. And the organism itself, maybe over a lifetime, stretches its neck a few inches, and then when its baby is born, it already has a longer neck, and that happens and goes on and so forth until we get giraffes with extremely long necks today. That's actually not how it happens, and what we'll talk about when we talk about evolution is organisms get these adaptations through what is called random mutation. And I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but just to keep in mind that an organism itself cannot want to evolve. It cannot want to get adaptations. It either gets the good end of the stick or the bad end of the stick with random mutations in their DNA. So let's play this game. Here are 4 different organisms. Are they alive or not? So we'll come back to this in a second. Let's go to here, this panda bear. Is this alive or not? Well, yes, it is alive. Here's a banana slug. Is this alive or not? Yes, it's alive. Here are some bacteria. Are bacteria alive? Well, let's think. They do need to do metabolic, some sort of metabolic metabolism. They do respond to stimuli. They do reproduce. They do adapt. So yes, bacteria are alive. Now this is a virus. This is a macrophage, a virus. Is that alive or not? Well, you might think, well, it probably is alive. They probably evolve and they probably do respond to stimulus and they probably do need some sort of metabolic activity. But interestingly enough, viruses are actually not alive. They're called non-cellular replicators. And the reason for that is they cannot survive and reproduce on their own. A virus that is living on a surface that doesn't have access to any other host organism will eventually die. The way that viruses work is they get into your cells and they overtake your cell's factory, basically, to produce more viruses. Without your cells, they cannot continue. So they are not considered to be living things. They do evolve, they do reproduce, but in order to reproduce, they have to do it through other cells, like your cells or in animals. So they are not considered to be living by scientists. Okay, so I told you that we're going to talk about animals, plants, all sorts of different organisms, protists, fungi. How do we organize life on Earth? Well, the first thing to know is that all organisms, like I told you, whether they are single-celled organisms or multi-celled organisms, they're all made up of cells. And there's two types of these cells, the eukaryotic cells and the prokaryotic cells. All life on Earth, it's made up of one of those two types of cells. We see eukaryotic cells up here. They are much, much larger, 10 times larger than these prokaryotic cells, although the images might make you think they're the same size. It is, in fact, the eukaryotic cells are larger. They're larger. They also have membrane-bound organelles. You can see here there are no organelles that are membrane-bound. They do have ribosomes. They also have a nucleus. Eukaryotes have a nucleus where the DNA is found. In prokaryotes, prokaryotic cell, the DNA just sort of hangs out in the middle of the cell, and that's called the nucleoid, where this, in the eukaryotic cell, the DNA is held in the nucleus. And so those are just a few differences that we'll talk about later when it comes to these different types of cells, but all of the organisms are made up of cells. So that was pretty much how it worked for a long time, where scientists basically said an organism is either prokaryotic or eukaryotic. And it wasn't until Dr. Carl Woese began to use genetic information to find out how organisms would relate to each other evolutionarily. And this obviously just couldn't happen because we didn't have this technology until about the 70s. And he, along with many, many other scientists, proposed all organisms should be characterized as occurring in one of three domains: the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukaryota. And so we're going to talk about all of these domains today, give some very basic information about all three of them, and then in the next one we'll begin with talking about animals that are in the eukaryota. So the domains bacteria and archaea are composed of organisms that have prokaryotic cells. Before we had this genetic information, we would have just said they're all just bacteria because they all look like it. But that's not the case anymore. And now domain eukarya are going to have all the organisms that have the eukaryotic cell type. The oldest known fossils of both archaea and bacteria are dating back to 3.5 billion years ago. Remember, Earth about 4.5, so it's about 1 million years before the first living organisms come up, and there are archaea and bacteria. The oldest known fossils of eukarya are as old as 1.9 billion years ago. So you can see archaea and bacteria dominated Earth for a very, very long time. The leading theory for the rise of what our eukarya are now known as is called the endosymbiotic theory. Well, what's the endosymbiotic theory? The endosymbiotic theory basically states that at some point there was an ancestral or just old type of prokaryote that began to get infolding of the plasma membrane. So the plasma membrane is what separates stuff on the outside of the cell from the inside of the cell. That started to infold, which is the beginning of a nucleus. And then there was an endosymbiosis, which means that some aerobic bacterium and a cyanobacterium is something that can do photosynthesis. Two bacteria entered this larger bacteria, and they started to live. Instead of getting eaten, they just started to live within this cell, and that became our very primitive mitochondria and our very primitive chloroplasts. And so this is the theory for which we went from only prokaryotes to now having eukaryotes. Now, I want to point out that a theory is not a hypothesis. So you'll hear people say this the wrong way many times, saying, "Oh, I have a theory about this," right? I have a theory about who killed this person, or I have a theory about blah blah blah. That's fine in colloquial language, but in the sciences, a theory is something that's basically fact. It's backed up by all of the research that's ever been done on the subject. It's never been disproven, and it's basically fact for science. So this is basically a fact, and the reason that we know this is because if you look at mitochondrial DNA and chloroplast DNA, they have DNA that is very, very similar to ancient aerobic and cyanobacterium. And so they're related. And so basically this points to this being the case. Just another point, hypotheses are guesses, educated guesses, basically, that we test doing the scientific method, which we'll talk about. And basically, the whole point of hypothesis is basically to prove it wrong. And until you can't prove it wrong, it is going to be the leading explanation. But once you get a ton and ton of scientific information that points to one specific hypothesis, it then becomes a theory. So that's just something I like to nitpick on, but that's the endosymbiotic theory. Let's keep moving. Okay, let's talk about the bacteria. The bacteria, they are separated by their shapes. So this domain is obviously most familiar to people because you're really familiar with the diseases that they can cause. However, most bacteria do not and also cannot cause disease. In fact, you are covered in bacteria, by the way, and if you're healthy, you have those bacteria to thank because you are giving them a space to live. The disease-causing bacteria do not have a space to live on your body or within your body. If we were to put you in a blender and made up into a human smoothie, as crude as that sounds, and you counted one by one the cells, you would actually be less than 50% human cells. So that's how many bacteria live on you. We also have bacteria to thank for producing antibiotics and some foods. So don't be too afraid of bacteria. Bacteria are normally made up of spheres, which you'll hear called cocci, like Streptococcus. You probably heard of that. But those are circular sphere bacteria. Then there are bacilli, or rod-shaped. You probably have heard of bacillus. Those are Salmonella is a bacillus. And then there are spirals, which are called chaetae, and you've probably heard of spirochetes before. But anyway, those are just the three different shapes and some information about bacteria. There are 5 major phyla that we'll talk about. The proteobacteria, which are E. coli, Salmonella, Legionella. Those are just some that you probably have heard of. Heliobacter pylori is a cause of many ulcers. Neisseria gonorrhea, which is a cause of gonorrhea. Those bacteria are very closely related to the eukaryotic mitochondria. And then the cyanobacteria, which are photosynthetic, they produce oxygen, O2 gas, that's oxygen. And over 2 billion years ago, those bacteria are the ones that made the oxygen-rich atmosphere in which we live. Those bacteria are very closely related to the eukaryotic chloroplasts. And so, guys, for the exam, that's the only 2 that I want you to remember. The proteobacteria, they're very similar to the eukaryotic mitochondria, and the cyanobacteria are very similar to the chloroplasts. Okay, so those are the ones I want you to remember for the exam. Then we'll talk about 3, 4, and 5 very quickly. There is also eubacteria, like Clostridium, which causes tetanus and botulism, Bacillus, Mycoplasma, which causes pneumonia. There's chlamydias, which causes parasites, Giardia, and also the chlamydia, the sexually transmitted disease, and then spirochetes, which can cause syphilis and Lyme disease. And I know it was fun for me to put all of these diseases, but trust me when I say that most of these bacteria cannot cause diseases. Okay, so there's the bacteria. Let's talk about Archaea. Archaea, like I said, were originally thought to be bacteria because when you look at them, and that's really all you can do, why not put them in the bacteria family, the bacteria characteristic? But When we got into them genetically, we found that they're actually more closely related to eukarya than to bacteria, and that's pretty mind-blowing. They possess genes which bacteria do not have, and they have several metabolic pathways. So that all points to them being closer related to eukarya. Archaea also can use more energy sources than eukaryotes. Those range from organic compounds like sugars, which we can use, but to things like ammonia, which are absolutely toxic to us, metal ions, even hydrogen gas. So really, really interesting guys, really, really interesting organisms. Um, Here are some that we'll look at. First are the methanogens or methane makers. They can only use carbon dioxide, hydrogen, and nitrogen to produce the energy that they need to live. And as a result of this, they give off methane gas. You'll find them in swamps, marshes, the guts of animals and humans. And by the way, that's why farts stink. A little fun fact there are these methanogens. And by the way, cattle, sorry, not cattle, cattle are one of the big reasons for human-made climate change is because of all the methane gas, which is a greenhouse gas that is produced by cow farts. So the more you know, I guess. The next are the extreme halophiles. Halo is salt. These guys are philia is love. They're salt lovers. And they're extreme. So they require an environment as salty or even up to 10 times saltier than ocean water. If you've ever been in the ocean, you know just how salty that is, so imagine 10 times saltier. And some prefer up to 30% salt concentrations. Those are basically live in the Dead Sea, the Great Salt Lake, and salt evaporation ponds. Then we've got the extreme thermophiles, which are heat and cold lovers, and they prefer temperatures above 106, sometimes 252 degrees Fahrenheit, or near or below freezing. And some thermophiles will actually just die at room temperature, right? Because it's not where their homeostatic environment is. Okay, and next and finally we have the eukarya. We've got protista in the eukarya, so protists are the single-celled eukaryotes. Those are the euglena, amoeba, paramecium, the fungi, which include mushrooms, bread molds, water molds, yeasts, the plantae, or the flowering plants. Well, flowering plants, which are angiosperms, and the gymnosperms, which are your conifers, ferns, mosses. The animals is where we're going to start next time. And with that, guys, welcome to this class. I hope you're going to have a good time, and I'll see you in the next one when we start talking about animals.